All right, so we're going to start. Friends, students, and colleagues, good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening from wherever you are coming from. I'm Yves Tibergin, Professor of Political Science, Konwakai Chair in Japanese Research, and Director of the Center for Japanese Research at UBC, located at the Institute of Asian Research and the SPPGA. Thank you for joining us in this dark moment of war. I would like to start by acknowledging the suffering, death, destruction, and horror endured by the people of Ukraine under the Russian invasion. We stand with the Ukrainian people through these horrifying developments. We're all Ukrainians now. Today, we meet in the spirit of peace, justice, reconciliation, and a common search for solutions to a common human crisis. So welcome to the first event in our three-part climate event series titled Negotiating at the Brink, How Does the World Solve the Climate Crisis? Co-organized by the Konwakai Chair with the Undergrad International Relations Student Association at UBC. So I'm turning over the microphone now to Patricia Gonzalez, URSA Vice President and co-moderator of this event. Patricia will offer our land acknowledgement in the name of all of us.
Thank you, Professor. Hi, everyone. My name is Patricia Gonzalez, and I am beyond excited to be co-moderating this event for you today. I'm one of the two VP externals at the International Relations Student Association here at UBC, as well as an undergraduate teaching assistant with the Department of Political Science. So before we move any further, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories that we're currently standing in. These territories belong to the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people who have called this area home for many thousands of years and continue to do so today. Since we're on a virtual platform and you may be joining us from all over the world, I would like to invite you to research the native land that you're currently standing on, since I know that you may not be aware of it. And a great resource to do so is this website called Native Land. And to access it, you can just go on nativeland.ca. I would also like to give a special thanks to the event organizers that put this together, from Christina to Fuma, from the Japanese Research Chair, as well as the IRSA team, comprised of myself, Jackie, Zora, and everyone else that kind of helped us put this event together. And I would also like to thank the Center for Japanese Research Assistants, Shiori Uchida, as well as the research assistants, Panthea and Hari. And we also would like to thank Michelle and Lindsay at the IAR and the SPGGA for their support. Now I can pass it on to Professor Eves again.
Thank you, Patricia. I'll just add a couple words on what is the Konwakai Chair. This year, the Konwakai Chair is focusing research, student engagement, and policy effort on the question of disruptions in the global order, with a special attention to Japan's and Canada's roles in those global developments in a comparative framework. The program this academic year includes climate change, digital and AI governance, peace and conflict management, and Indo-Pacific strategies. Our first event, the Climate Summit Legacy, Ambition, and Unmet Goals, the COP26 Retrospective, will look into the outcomes of the COP26, providing an evaluation of the conference, including its success, shortcomings, as well as how we can make future improvements for future conferences. There were definitely a lot of expectations. There was innovation. There was a lot of drama built up around the Glasgow conference last fall. Today, we take stock. What happened and what did not happen? Did it make a difference? And are we changing the trajectory of climate disruption in this crucial decade? I'm turning over now to Patricia again.
Thank you, Professor. So today we're joined by a group of marvelous speakers who are going to share their insights on the last climate summit that we saw in Glasgow. And through this, we're hoping to get a better understanding of the current state of climate politics. So just before we move on to that, I would just like to take a few moments to introduce them all and their contributions to the conversations on climate politics, and more specifically, COP26. But just before moving on to that, I would like to pass it on to Professor Michael Small, just to give us a little bit of overview on the context that we're going to be speaking about, since I know that many of us are not experts on the topic. Professor Dr. Michael Small is an adjunct professor at UBC School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, as well as a fellow at both Simon Fraser University and Harvard University. So if I could just pass on the mic to you, Professor, that would be fantastic.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I'm going to be really brief because you'll hear me a moment after the excellent video presentation. Just a little bit of context for people who are coming to this who are completely new to international climate negotiations. What we'll be talking about are the results of the meeting last November 2021 in Glasgow, of the Conference of the Parties. Well, that's what COP stands for. It was the 26th one of those meetings, and those take place on the basis of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. The UNFCCC, the Framework Convention, was signed at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, came into effect, I think, the following year, and has met every single year in a Conference of the Parties from 1995 up until the year 2020. There was a one-year disruption for well understood reasons because of COVID. So the most recent meeting of the Conference of the Parties was COP26. Really, the framework for COP26 and the expectations were shaped by an essential meeting that took place 6 years earlier in Paris in 2015, where COP21 approved the Paris Agreement, which is now the legal framework for international negotiations on climate change. It's really what the previous 21 meetings had built up to. And Glasgow was about taking stock and moving forward beyond the Paris Agreement. So just a little bit of vocabulary I thought we'd share. And of course, the experts here will be very happy to unpack and explain things further. I think I'll now give it back to you, Patricia.
Perfect. Thank you for providing us with that. I think that's definitely necessary as we move forward and continue with the talk. So our first speaker is, unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us today, but has sent us a video instead, just so that she's able to share her expertise with everyone on here. Her name is Dr. Jennifer Allan, and she is a strategic advisor and team leader with the Earth Negotiations Bulletin and a lecturer at Cardiff University. Christina, would you be kind enough to please broadcast Dr. Allan's video? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, and I'm very sorry I couldn't be with you live, but time zones are conspiring against us. For some quick remarks, I think what I'll do is start with what Glasgow was supposed to achieve, and then move on to some of the sort of political level pressure and outcomes that we had, and then move on to a couple of the kind of lower profile but really important outcomes that Glasgow achieved. So to start, Glasgow was never meant to adopt a new treaty or have some big outcome agreement. Really, Glasgow was meant as a proof of concept. So the goal was to show that the Paris Agreement could work. The Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015, it entered into force in 2016, and it started working, it really kind of took effect in 2020 when it took over from the Kyoto Protocol. So Glasgow was the first meeting that there was since the Paris Agreement started working. And because of that, it was really meant to show that this agreement, this treaty, could be a useful, effective response to the climate crisis. That was the goal for Glasgow. Now, if we break down that big, broad goal a bit, it means that the pledges that countries are supposed to submit under the Paris Agreement, that those had to be ratcheted up to show that we had some hope of hitting 1.5 or 2 degrees in the future. Also, financial pledges. There was a big expectation that Glasgow would at least mobilize or hopefully get us near some of the goals that are in the financial world for climate finance. On both of these, I'll just give you a spoiler alert, Glasgow failed. So we'll go into it probably more in the discussion as to why, but even though there was 150 world leaders there, there was a huge mobilization to try to get countries to bring forward better agreements, and there was a sense of kind of peer pressure amongst world leaders that they had to show up and make a speech that would announce something. Most countries basically just repeated what was in their pledges that they had submitted earlier in the year. India brought forward a new net zero pledge and renewable energy targets. South Korea, I believe, brought forward a new pledge, they're called nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And China improved its NDC a little bit, its pledge. That's it. There were new financial pledges, but on the mitigation, the reducing emissions front, Glasgow got us to maybe about 2.4 degrees of global warming if all those pledges and all those net zero targets are firmly and fully implemented. And that's a big if, frankly. So Glasgow didn't raise ambition like we needed it to. We saw all these other political outcomes, like there was the global methane pledge, there was the Glasgow Declaration to end deforestation by 2030. So we saw a lot of these coalitions of smaller groups of countries pop up. The problem with those is that they are actually entirely outside of the framework of the UN negotiations. They're kind of little glitter balls that you add onto the Christmas tree. So there's no reporting mechanism for them to come back and say how they're doing. There's no accountability mechanisms if countries join these alliances and they never do anything. They really are these sort of ad hoc coalitions that don't necessarily have any follow-up or feedback. Especially that's true of all the coalitions that sprung up that were among companies. So there's no real feedback mechanism for them to come back and say to the world, we've hit our target or we haven't. And that's really difficult and really kind of important to remember, especially when we think about forests. Because there's been the New York Declaration on Forests to have deforestation by 2030. We've had in the SDGs and in the Convention on Biological Diversity targets to reduce deforestation by 2020. And all those targets are completely missed or we're not on track to hit them. So another forest pledge to this time end deforestation. I really don't know how we're going to do that when we're not on track to even have it or halve it, put it in half by 2030. So we're really struggling on the deforestation front, like on the climate front, and without these kind of mechanisms, it's difficult to know if all these efforts at Glasgow and these coalitions will lead to much. So that's kind of some of the political stuff, and there was a lot of glitz and glamour at the Glasgow COP. There was 150 odd world leaders, royalty was there, Idris Elba was there, a lot of celebrities, Obama gave a speech. So we saw a lot of high-level events happening, and there was a lot of effort to kind of showcase this as a huge global summit. There were 40,000 people registered. Now, just to remind you, I'm sure you don't need reminding, but in November we were still very firmly in the pandemic. Usually at a climate meeting in recent years, we're hitting about 20,000, maybe 25,000 people at the most. And so a lot of people thought that the UK government would cap how many people could come. The venue only held 10 to 12,000 people. And so there was a big expectation of sort of balancing the needs to be inclusive, but also realistically saying, look, we're in the middle of a pandemic here. But instead, the government in the UK did the opposite, to the surprise of everyone that I've talked to, including the UN Secretariat. So they allowed basically anyone who wanted to register and show up in Glasgow. So there were huge lines that were 2 hours long for people to get in. There was big security queues because you have to go through an airport-style security. And it was packed in that venue. So even though there were efforts to make sure that the negotiation seating was spread out, if you were in the hallways or if you were in the more sort of free-flowing exhibition-type areas, those were absolutely packed. It was shoulder to shoulder, nose to nose. So it was very confusing to everyone about the logistics of this meeting. It was also confusing because if observers couldn't get in, they were told, well, go online. We have this portal so you can access the meeting, but you could only access it if you were physically in the UK. So they made people travel to Glasgow just to go online from their hotel. So there's a lot of confusing things about this, and I mention it because it matters, not only from a public health perspective, although the COP, it's been shown, didn't lead to any increases in cases in Glasgow. But it also matters because we have to think about equity. And so developing countries, they sent delegates and they faced weeks-long journeys because of all of the travel restrictions on the way and the need to self-isolate. Some NGO delegates also faced similar difficulties. And so opening it up and allowing all this huge media attention, all these extra delegates to come, this 40,000 people, actually made it more difficult for many to participate. And inviting all these heads of state meant that when they were there, security was clamped down. And so out of the thousands of civil society members that were there, sometimes only about 20 were allowed to access the area where negotiations were happening because it was completely blocked off because of heads of state. So a lot of the time in the COP, especially in the first week with heads of state there, we saw all this glitz, all this glamour, all these, big speeches by heads of state and David Attenborough, but there were real equity issues underlying all of that. And that matters when we think about some of the kind of under the radar outcomes of this COP. So the heads of state, everyone was there for the first 2-3 days, and then they left. Biden got on a helicopter out the back door of it's called the VVIP entrance, the very, very important person entrance that heads of state are shuffled out of. And so then we were left with just negotiations, which is the core of UN climate change work. Now, they had a few really important issues to work on because, this Paris Agreement, while it was in effect, you get agreement in treaties by having some pretty vague wording. And the Paris Agreement is full of it. So what they were trying to do is write a rule book for how exactly do countries interpret some of these clauses and phrases within the Paris Agreement to make sure that they're all implementing in a similar way. So there's a few standouts on this. One was that they had to finish sort of the market mechanisms, figure out exactly how these market mechanisms are going to work, what kind of credits can be generated, who can sell, how can we support the poorest countries to participate in these markets, because traditionally they've been left out. They also had to work on reporting mechanisms, make sure that countries are reporting their efforts and their emissions reductions in similar ways. And they had to set up a cycle for when these pledges are going to be communicated. So on all three of those pretty big name issues, we have agreement. And that's really the outcome of Glasgow, is now this rule book is finished, completely done, and there's nothing left to do in the global climate process except implement. And this is really one of the first times that we've been in this space where we just implement since 1992. There's always been sort of some negotiation happening in the background, or we've been waiting for the treaty to enter into force. This is the first time that there's a treaty, it's entered into force, there's nothing left to negotiate. All that's left is countries to act and the mechanisms to hold them accountable. So that's really the big legacy of Glasgow. A little bit of attention, well, I shouldn't say a little bit, there was a lot of attention on something called the Glasgow Climate Pact. Now this was sort of an overarching decision. It was actually a set of 3 decisions that kind of tried to fill some of the gaps and set the agenda for the future. This was a pain. There was no need for these negotiations to happen. So this was purely a presidential effort. And we've been seeing more of these in recent years. So this was an effort to find a space to issue a call for better pledges to come in next year, for example, or to include language on fossil fuel subsidies. So this was an extra negotiation that the presidency and countries agreed to do on top of all the agendas. And it was okay. I mean, it caused a lot of problems because there's duplication between issues on the agenda and these cover decisions. So now we have to look in multiple places for the same issue. It created space for new ideas to come forward, like phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. It also, though, created sort of a dynamic of blame. So China and India got a lot of blame at the end for changing wording about phasing out unabated coal to phasing down unabated coal. And it's unfortunate because, for starters, the US was right there with them. Kerry and Xing Shenhua and the Minister of Environment from India, whose name is completely escaping me right now, they left. They went out the back room. Alok Sharma, the COP president, went with them. They were there for half an hour. They figured it all out. And the language they came up with was very, very similar to what the US and China had agreed to days before about phasing down coal. So the US is just as culpable here, but didn't get much of the blame. And in the end, this Glasgow Pact, we don't know how the follow-up's going to go. We don't really know how to treat these types of decisions. And language in it like phasing down coal, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, it's not new. G20's been trying to do things like phasing out fossil fuel subsidies for a long time. It doesn't really matter. It's sort of a normative claim. It's an ambition, but there won't be any follow-up that happens on, hey, how are you doing phasing out that unabated coal? So it really is a shame that there was this sort of blame dynamic created by this decision for something that's largely symbolic. So I guess on the whole, COP was very mixed. Logistics were terrible. There's a few own goals by the presidency, like on some of these covering decisions. We didn't get the ambition that we needed, and we didn't get the finance we needed. So developed countries still haven't met a 10-year-old promise to provide $100 billion a year, and they probably won't meet it till 2023. But what matters is that this rule book is finished, and now it really is purely action and accountability. So again, apologies that I can't be there with you, but I hope you have an excellent discussion and look forward to future events.
Wow, I had never had the pleasure to hear Dr. Jennifer Allan speak, but that was definitely a great resource that I'm glad we were able to include, because I think she did raise really interesting claims and things that I honestly had no knowledge about. So I'll definitely be doing further research after hearing her speak. But just for now, I would like to pass it back to Professor Michael Small, who's going to do his little introduction as well. And just as a reminder to all of our panelists, we would appreciate it if you could try to keep your opening remarks to be in the 8 to 10 minute radius, just so that we can fit everyone in and still do our Q&A at the end.
Well, thanks very much, Patricia. I just want to make sure you can hear me. My sound is good. Well, look, I'm very pleased to follow on from Jennifer. I've known Jennifer Allan. She did her PhD on environmental politics at UBC. She's a UBC graduate. I first met her when I moved to SFU here to Vancouver in 2015. And in fact, I hosted her giving at least 2 talks explaining the structure of environmental negotiations that led up to the Paris Agreement and subsequently. Her talk, Unpacking the Paris Accord, was by a factor of 10 the most widely viewed of any of the videos of this series that I was hosting. And you can see what a capable explainer she is. She didn't have a chance to explain in that video, and this will illustrate a point I'm about to make. She's the lead writer for a remarkable institution called the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, which is actually an initiative of a civil society organization, a Canadian-based think tank, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which takes a team of writers to each of the environmental negotiations, not just climate change, but climate change is probably their bread and butter. And they've been doing it since the original Rio Earth Summit. Full disclosure, I gave them their very first $5,000 in life. So I kind of have a lifetime membership in the thing. Anyhow, Jennifer carries on that tradition. The reason why she's able to speak to you with such degree of authority is that she and the staff, the writers who work with her, are in all those negotiating rooms. So I guess the first thing I would say is, and were Jennifer with us, we could have a little bit of a debate. I'll illustrate a few places where I think the glass is maybe a little more full than she illustrated. But by way of context, I used to be a Canadian diplomat. I went to lots of different negotiations, particularly back in the days, briefly, when there was such a thing as a G8 and the precursor to the G20 and to the United Nations. The negotiations around the COPs, the Conference of the Parties, in their own way, they are the most transparent international negotiations. And I say that for a couple of reasons. First of all, there is this enormous attendance. So you can critique whether 38,000 people should go to Glasgow, or probably the next one coming up this year will have 15 to 20,000 people. And everyone going should make up their own mind whether they should incur the flight miles, et cetera, et cetera. But there's no other international negotiation which has so many participants and so many avenues for participation. The reason why there are so many people, apart from the overriding importance of the issues, are that over the years, the United Nations, the Framework Convention, has accredited over 1,000 observer delegations. So I was there as for Simon Fraser University. University of British Columbia is also there, as are several hundred other universities. But it's not just universities. You have civil society organizations, you have grassroots organizations, you have trade unions, you have business associations, you have think tanks of all stripes. You have organizations pursuing multiple agendas on labor, on human rights, on indigenous rights, all different aspects of environmental rights, certainly on development and on many other topics that converge on these meetings and try to link up their agendas with what's going on in the climate change agenda. That's why they're so large. They're also structured organizationally in a way to accommodate that number of people. Now, Glasgow was a bit pinched. Glasgow is not a terribly big city by international standards. It's about 600,000 people. It's probably what, the 7th or 8th largest city in the UK. So it's the conference venue was reasonably big, but not as big as Paris or other places. So there were some physical constraints, and also there were COVID constraints. But nevertheless, what happens at these things, and I say this because some of you may well want to go to one of these COPs, to a future one. You might go if you're a current UBC student, find out if you can get accredited. You might go with a student organization. There are many different avenues to be there. And there's nothing like being on the inside of these events to get a sense of how they work. So you have the central piece are the international negotiations that Jennifer just described, and those go on in a main conference room and a few side rooms. NGOs do have access to that, but it's limited in terms of the numbers of people they can accommodate. And usually NGOs that have a particular interest in following the negotiations closely will seek to represent their constituency, to be in those rooms, to be able to report out on what's going on. But then in addition to that, there is a series of events around that called side events, usually 2 or 3 large pavilions. That's where I happen to spend my time, where governments, where international organizations, where business associations are running their own parallel conferences. And so I spent a lot of my time walking around and listening to 60 or 70 different sets of continuous conferences going on. It could be on water, they could be on methane, they could be from the perspectives from the Gulf states, they could be from the perspectives of the small island states, they could be hosted by the government of Indonesia, they could be hosted by the government of Russia. I'm naming actual pavilions. If I had more time, I could show you some blurry snapshots I took. There's a huge amount of energy that goes on, and that's just inside the main conference area if you have a UN pass. Then there's also another area which is open to the general public called the Green Zone. Sometimes that's physically adjacent to the main conference site. If the place is big enough, in Glasgow, that was at a different conference venue about 2 kilometers away. And that is open to anybody. You don't need to be registered with an organization. You can be an interested member of the public. Obviously, in the city where it's located, it's most accessible to those folks, but you could come from anywhere. And that's where it's even more of a civil society and media-driven event. I shouldn't overlook the media. I mean, I think that 38,000 people figure includes media. There's an enormous number of every conceivable media. And of course, in this era of social media, you probably might have seen some pictures where a huge globe of the earth was in one of the main conference halls. I never passed that thing without seeing 3 different people giving a continuous press conference in any UN language and many others as well going on. That's what people used it for. So there's a lot of projection out. I guess what I would also want to highlight, and here I'll take a little bit of difference with Jennifer. Countries really did, I mean, not all of them improved their pledges, that's for sure, but a lot of them used the year 2021 as the year to in which to improve their pledges. And that's what was required under the UN, under the Paris Agreement. Every 5 years, you should either equal your pledge or better it. So Canada, for example, increased quite significantly what it was committing to do by 2030. And that was announced in April 2021. I personally don't see there's a big difference between Prime Minister Trudeau announcing something in April 21 or announcing it at the COP itself. Nevertheless, the larger point still stands. Countries were not making commitments that come anywhere close achieving the target of the Paris Agreement, which is to bring the world under 2 degrees above industrial levels and to make best efforts to achieve 1.5 degrees of warming. And that is important. I think the only other thing I just will add is just one other thing on transparency, and then I'll let our other speakers comment. This COP was interesting because it was really transitioning to a digital era. And I have been to 3 previous ones. Before, you physically had to be on the conference site to understand what was going on. But because there was such interest and because, frankly, the technology had now caught up, they were webcasting a lot of events actually on the conference site. So you could be physically there, but discovered it was coming from a studio, which you couldn't physically get access to, but you could tune into from anywhere in the world. And I actually would like to correct Jennifer on that point, because I absolutely know people who followed the entire conference of the parties sitting in Victoria, for example. You needed to be registered as a delegate, but if you did, you had access to it. And then all of that stuff is archived. More importantly, every side event I went to had speakers coming in from all over the planet. My university co-hosted one. We had speakers from the Caribbean, an important speaker from New Delhi. She traveled over Zoom, and every single event did that. We'll see more of that. So we're moving into a hybrid space, which means no matter which location or time zone we're going to be in, all of this conversation and events are going to be more accessible to people like the folks listening to this webinar. I guess the last thing I'll just say is, and we can all debate whether, what expectations did it meet? Clearly, the world is not on a track yet to meet the stated goals of the climate agreement, and we can unpack why that is. And that's a depressing fact and an extremely important fact. I go to these things because I always come away inspired by the sheer amount of human ingenuity and energy and the diversity of opinions. I hear points of view I could never hear anywhere else. I hear from a cross range of countries I would never hear anywhere else. And I come away inspired by at least the sheer knowledge and the number of different people who are working hard with incredible commitment to find solutions. And for me, I find it's worthwhile going to it. And I hope others might be inspired to think about attending future such events. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor. And it might have been difficult to stick to the time constraint. So I appreciate you fitting as much as you did there, because you did touch on a lot of important pieces that I think are worth acknowledging. I will now pass it over to Dr. Sandeep Pai, who is a researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Climate Investment Funds, where he leads the Just Transition Initiative. Just before leading the initiative, he was also a climate politics journalist at the Hindustan Times. Professor or Doctor, would you like to go ahead and just share your minutes? Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I'm also a UBC alumni, so I'm really excited to be here. So I guess, between Jennifer and Michael, you've covered a lot of topics that I wanted to speak. So I'm going to modify a little bit of what I had thought about. In terms of focus on some of the hits and misses of these the Glasgow conference, and what those hits and misses mean for an emerging economy. And I'll take the case of India, where I have focused a lot of my work on. So I think for me, some of the, although not part of the negotiations, it is significant that many countries around the world, not China, India, US, and the likes, but many newer countries have now at least publicly said that they will phase out coal. We can argue whether the date, is it appropriate? Like some are saying 2035, some are saying 2040, Poland is saying 2050. But nonetheless, this is the beginning of a time where many countries, many more countries which have significant coal resources are now talking about phasing out coal. In the case of India, US, and China, which by the way represents 70% of global coal, they have at least agreed to a phase down. For me, that's a big win. If you were to talk to an Indian delegation 2 years back and say, hey, sign on to a phase down deal, they'll throw you out of the room. But so that I think is a big win. And that this is, Paris and the whole negotiation is based on this ratchet mechanism, right? So while in Glasgow, if now we are talking about phase down, I'm sure in Egypt, and then subsequently, we'll talk about, okay, when do you phase down and things like that. So I think this opening of talking about phasing down coal was a really positive development, although, it doesn't mean anything. There's no timelines here, but just the fact that it was there was significant. The second was the methane pledge, which I won't get into, but nonetheless, many 100 countries signed on to reduce methane emissions by 2030. That I think is also significant. The Paris rule book that Jennifer talked about was the most important reason why this conference was happening, was also really, really significant. The forestry pledge, again, was very significant. One of the very interesting developments that happened was the South African Just Transition Deal. I think it's a model deal, and if I really hope that it is successful, because it's a deal where an emerging economy is getting money to phase down its most important fossil fuel, which is coal, and it will be used both to pay to ramp up renewables, but also to make sure that the workers and the communities and the regions and the companies who will suffer as a result of this phase down will have access to finance. So I really hope that 2 years from now, South Africa doesn't complain that we haven't got the money and it is merely a pledge, because that's a good model. If successful, you can take to Indonesia, to India, to other emerging markets, because Asia is the future of energy, right? Like that's where all the energy demand is growing in the future. And so if you want Asia to not carbonize the way West carbonized, you need to make sure that finance is available. So that South African deal is a model of, and has the potential to be a really significant sort of like underlying success for Glasgow. But I'm also skeptical. Let's see what happens. I hope the money comes through, and it's not all in the forms of like high interest loans, but it is also in the form of like grants and concessional finance and things like that. So that I think was also a big hit as far as I'm concerned. I think the Glasgow Pact, despite all the issues with it, was a success, because one of the things it does is it calls countries to come back again in Egypt this year and to update their NDCs. I think otherwise the updation of NDCs would have happened 5 years from but now, since countries would come to Egypt, they'll have to say something. So there may be there are some countries, and let me come to setbacks where I'll talk about the NDCs, but there may be some scope that countries will ratchet their NDCs further in Egypt. So those were, I think, broadly some of the successes. The big setback for me is the finance. I think without finance, it'll be very, very difficult for emerging markets to both adapt, to mitigate, and to deal with the whole issue of climate finance. I'll deal with this finance question with a very specific example of India. Loss and damage, a long-standing demand from emerging economies to include that in the agreement was also, didn't see much success. And so that's another big loss. The third is that, people were hoping that countries would come with really ambitious NDCs. In fact, almost 40 countries didn't even update their NDCs. So that is also a big setback beyond the other points I mentioned. The last So let's just focus on finance, why I think it's so critical. So if you think about a country like India, which has now declared a net zero by 2070, India is a country whose energy demand is going to double, triple. By the way, when you think about, North America or Europe and other parts of OECD world, the energy demand is flat or declining, but India's energy demand is going to go up. So when you have to achieve that kind of energy demand, you have option to, ramp up renewables, but you also don't want to phase out your fossil fuels because you do need a lot more energy. In the case of Canada or US or other countries, you're replacing one fuel with the other, which is, I'm not saying easy, but easier switch compared to when you're trying to add a lot of energy. So for that to happen, India needs finance in the areas of clean energy. So both, not just like, loans and all that, but like you really need some finance to make sure that the costs of power comes down and it's useful, and then it can compete with, fossil fuels at grid parity and all that. So one is the area of clean energy where India needs finance and lots, and calculations range from $1 to $3 trillion. I mean, even the most green groups in India would say that you would need like this much finance and so on. So that's one. The second area is you want to wind down this fossil fuels. Okay, this is an ecosystem. This is an industry which was created 50 years, and so you have many players, and most of it state-owned enterprises, state-owned companies funded by state-owned banks. Railways are dependent on coal and so on. So you and millions of workers, pensioners, and 6-7 states that are deeply dependent on coal. So the kind of deal that happened in South Africa, you need finance to pay for what is called just energy transition for these places. Now, some of the funds, mind you, like India's can raise domestically. It's a large market, it can raise domestically, but it nonetheless needs some finance. The third area is loss and damage. One of the current IPCC, the most recent IPCC report shows India is one of the most vulnerable countries. So it is facing impacts as of today, even before it can adapt. So you need some financial mechanisms to deal with the current loss and damage. And the final piece is, for a country like India, it needs to adapt and adapt quickly. And so you need to build so much infrastructure as the country goes. So without a clear-cut understanding of how these financial flows will go to India, either in the form of investments by big players or in the form of loans, like low-interest loans and grants, it'll be very difficult for India to implement its NDCs. So while countries can update their NDCs, we can have good Glasgow Pacts, but in the absence of finance, emerging economies will struggle to meet their NDCs. I'll just stop there, but I can take more questions on any of the other aspects during the Q&A.
Thank you so much. I think, touching on the finance piece early on too is good for providing the context and obviously the restraints of all the claims that politicians and experts make. So thank you for sharing that. Also talking about how realistic all of this is given the financial constraints was an amazing add to the discussion. So I appreciate that. But now I will pass it on to our next panelist. So Dr. Florentine Koppenberg, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Chair of Environmental and Climate Policy at TUM School of Governance at the Technical University of Munich in Germany. Florentine, are you okay going ahead?
Yes, thank you, Patricia.
Of course.
So, well, a few things that I had thought about mentioning were already mentioned. So I'm basically going to share a few impressions because Michael Small, I could not agree more going there. And I went to COP for the first time last year. It's eye-opening. I mean, I had been studying it sort of, well, theoretically, as scholars often do for years. And then going there, I now have a whole new understanding. And I would encourage anyone who is interested in going there, or at least following negotiations. And here, building on this comment that COP is becoming more digital, the website called UNFCCC Stream World basically allows you to access recordings of most negotiations. and you can search them by topic and everything. It's an amazing resource, and it's open to anyone, not just people in the UK. The UK presidency website was only open to people in the UK, but that website was useless anyway. So go to the UNFCCC website and you'll find wonderful recordings. I mean, my first impression going to COP was actually, oh, wow, what a climate circus. Because you do have negotiations, you have pavilions, which are basically like one big fair of ideas and actors presenting themselves. Then you have the civil society space, you have the academic space, and the green zone across the river. It took me a whole day to see everything, just to find my way around. And then you really start to follow the negotiations. And here I would like to focus on 2 points. One is something that Sandeep has also mentioned, that is the issue, of coal and coal phase outs or phase downs. I will tie this in a little bit with the EU perspective, because interestingly, when I was talking to, an EU negotiator just a day after COP, and also listening to an EU official during a talk evaluating COP later, they both said that including phase down language in the Glasgow climate COP was not something they had expected. And unlike Sandeep, they didn't even go back 2 years. They basically said 15 days ago, like 2 days before COP during the G20 meeting in Rome, they had thought this would be impossible to get in there. But then the UK presidency pushed really hard. And you know how it goes in negotiations? You float a draft that has your maximum, your ideal outcome. And that was the first language that was passed around, really saying we need a coal phase out. Of course, you factor in some negotiation time that will usually lead to compromises. And I was there, I sort of watched it when at the very last minute, negotiators were running around talking about whether it will be coal phase out, phase down, and then you couldn't actually go in the room, but you saw it on screens. You saw negotiators sort of huddling together, talking about things. And I even saw one of the EU negotiators sort of rush off to one of the bilateral meeting rooms. It turned out later that actually Sandeep, he went to the Indian negotiator to offer them pretty much the same deal they had offered South Africa. But they said, oh no, this is too last minute. But that is just to say that the EU seems rather interested in using South Africa as a model. And there are certainly a number of influential and well-connected NGOs in Germany that are pushing really hard for this to become a model. So just like you, I do hope this becomes something that we see more of, because I think we need this, definitely. So here, to come back to the EU perspective, the EU was extremely happy about this language, and they worked hand in hand with the UK presidency, which for me as a European was heartwarming, because, after Brexit, you never know. But it was as if Brexit had never happened. So that was in a way beautiful. And so, yeah, they worked really hard to get the best outcome, to convince India to isolate China, which didn't work. And I actually felt bad for India, because it was an Indian delegate who raised his hand and basically said, we would like a change in language. So all that criticism is very much akin to killing the messenger. So I didn't think that was fair, but that's sometimes how it goes. So that would be my point on coal. And just to connect that a little bit to what I've been doing on Japan, Japan didn't oppose this language. But basically the Japanese government then at home in Japanese said, oh yes, our plan of producing almost 20% of our electricity from coal in 2030 is perfectly in line with the phase down language, period. That was that. So, some speak up, some just translate it into whatever fits their energy policy. And I'm actually writing a little piece on that, because I think Japan's opposition is getting totally lost in translation, which is a pity. More people should read about that. Now, the second point is actually on financing. And Sandeep has touched upon this, but also Jennifer. And I think here, this inability of the global north to actually come up with this $100 billion per year in climate finance that they first promised in 2009. It has been so long. and they still have not been able to do this. This is a huge problem for their credibility. I mean, if you promise something over and over and over again and you never actually deliver it. Here there was a negotiator from Kenya who was speaking on behalf of the African Union during one of the stock takes during the second week. And he was basically saying on behalf of the African Union, trust has been lost. Personally, his trust has been shattered, and that those who have omitted most historically must do the most. So really this justice question, or in the way the question of historical responsibility, who needs to do how much, is really coming up again. And one thing the Paris Agreement did so beautifully was use nice legal language, diplomatic language to patch it all over. Basically, the Paris Agreement says that yes, every country shall prepare NDCs that become more ambitious. But only a few lines further down in the Paris Agreement, it also says support shall be provided to developing country parties for the implementation. So essentially, I read the Paris Agreement as a deal, money for ambition, or you give money to get more ambition. And looking at the NDCs, more and more NDCs, and this is the last point I'm making, I'm close to the time limit, but these nationally determined contributions, they include so-called conditional elements. These are elements where countries say, I will take this measure if I get financial support, technical support, usually these two. Some also have to do with institutional support, etc. But the first thing mentioned is always money. And the number of NDCs that include conditional elements has increased a lot from 2015 to 2021. And actually the Secretariat of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, provides these syntheses reports. If you look at the graphs, you can see that the conditional elements actually are what makes the difference between plateauing emissions and finally peaking. So my hypothesis essentially is, unless we get those $100 billion a year, which by the way are an arbitrary political number that is nowhere near sufficient, unless we get at least that, if not more, we will not peak emissions anytime soon, because if you don't uphold your promises, it's really hard to pressure others to do more. And I know this is a bit of a harsh evaluation of the global North's performance, but in a way, this is me passing on a lot of what I heard in conversations at COP. There's so much frustration about that. And if you strike a deal, you have to uphold your end of the bargain, even if it's difficult. And on that note, I will end and pass on.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think that that critical analysis was definitely necessary. So thank you for sharing that with us. And though you brought up some really good points throughout your little bit of an intro, I did want to fixate on Japan's stance, just because that's going to be the topic of next week's conversation. So if anyone here is interested or thought that what Florentine shared about Japan is something that you want to learn more about, we will be having a conversation on Japan's stance specifically next week with Japanese experts. But yes, I just thought I would plug that in there because, of course, why not? But last but not least, I will pass it on to Karolina, who is a Master of Arts student at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And she is a researcher on environmental sustainability, as well as an advocacy professional who has worked within the intersection of international affairs and climate change in not only Canada, but also in Switzerland, Sweden, and Costa Rica.
Thank you very much. It's always exciting going last because I'm just listening to all of your incredible contributions, and very much indeed, most of the things that I was going to talk about was already mentioned. But I do think it's interesting because I come very much from the activist end of the spectrum, civil society, and I think the overall narrative within activist groups and the civil society movements when it comes to efforts on environment and sustainability really is a rather dire and negative picture. I think, Greta Thunberg called COP26 a complete failure. So it's quite interesting because I usually have the role of being the more of an optimist, which is interesting because this panel really has highlighted that, things were moving. And I think it's very essential to remember that COP26 cannot and should not be seen as a complete failure. I think that is dangerous. And I think, especially for the general public, that gives kind of an opportunity or to give into denialism when it comes to this. And I think the media often portrays these negotiations as in a rather negative light. So I think it's really exciting to see that this panel kind of tried to change that narrative. So just to build on a little bit of what everyone said, I think COP26 really focused on this idea of climate justice and historical contributions to the crisis that we're currently in. And I think that is really where we have to put in a lot of work. Because if you think of COP26, it's important to remember it's not just one event. And I think that is something that I know for myself before I went to COP and before I, read into the history of international negotiations on environment, it's easy to forget. And I think for me to see COP26 as a puzzle piece in the puzzle of solving, or at least adapting to climate change, is a very good way of viewing it, because we have really, since 1972 with the Stockholm conference, we really have built a lot on the normative legal framework of what we have to do. But really, when it comes to implementation and action, that's where economic development considerations really tend to take precedence. And I think moving forward with all the promises made and the progress made at COP26, for example, with the South Africa deal, and also mentioning coal, saying phase down, I completely agree with the fact that I see that as a success. And I think it's important not to read into it too much, because even mentioning coal sets a huge precedent also for the financial sector to realize that this is the end of fossil fuels and the end of coal. So I think that is very much progress being made. But I think as we move forward, especially coming from a social justice perspective, I tend to see that we don't have time to invest in negative solutions. And I think, or solutions that aren't holistic. And I think this is important to remember, that this is about the lives of human beings. And it's not in the abstract, it's happening right now. And I think when we're making sure to implement what has been done at COP and what will also continue to be promised, we need to make sure that we take that human rights and justice perspective into account. For example, I remember speaking to a lot of representatives of indigenous populations at COP26, and they were mentioning a fear that, in the Glasgow Pact, there isn't enough regulatory processes to make sure that investments in, say, for example, large dam projects don't harm the livelihoods of indigenous populations or damage biodiversity, because that is, to me, one of the big things that we have to continue working on. And I think that is also something that, as a young person, part of the civil society, we need to remember that COP26 wasn't the beginning and it's also not the end. We really are continuing this process. And to make sure that we keep our governments accountable, especially coming from the global north, just as all the wonderful panelists have mentioned, this is up to us. How can we make sure that countries stick to their promises and we move away from normative developments to implementation? And I believe that that is really the role of citizens, voting, making sure to put pressure on the government. And the foundation of that really is understanding the role of historical emissions, and also seeing it as a deeply, justice-based issue, and really focusing on compassion and the human experience that comes with climate disasters, etc. So I think really that is something that I think we need to push forward on in the future, and especially with Stockholm +50 coming up. To every one of you here today, especially students at UBC, there is a lot of ways to get involved, and I highly recommend looking into how to do that for Stockholm Plus 50, because the work is still continuing to be done. So that is mainly the one thing that I think is important to remember. Another thing that I just wanted to say, for me as a young person going to my first COP in Glasgow, it was supposed to be the most inclusive COP, but I found, and I know that this is true for many people, that it was one of the most exclusive COPs because of the fact that COVID really made it difficult for young people with observer badges to access these spaces to make our voice heard. And I think that is something that is essential because, as I mentioned before, we need to make sure that we have a diversity of perspectives and that we cannot exclude certain groups, and especially not youth. And that is something that I think we need to focus on for future conferences and implementations. Otherwise, I think I'm kind of building on what everyone said, but that is my main kind of takeaway. I also think that one of the most important things that we have kind of forgotten, I think, when it comes to these overall big discussions on climate change is just this idea that it goes beyond political divides. And I think it's important to think of, why did the Paris Agreement become so successful? And you can argue, as many people have said, that it was also the success of China, US being able to actually collaborate and join together. And that is one thing that I feel that the world is becoming more and more polarized, and especially with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this polarization is really continuing. And if we want to stand a chance of actually adapting to climate change and making the progress needed, we really need to focus on collaboration and set differences aside. So I think there is a lot of work to be done, but I just want to end this kind of overall introduction to that you all have contributed to, with really this idea that we have to focus on compassion and collaboration, and we have to remain optimistic. I think this is very much our responsibility, and especially as young people, part of civil society. We'll stop there.
Thank you so much for your contributions, Karolina. I am also very glad that you were able to take everything in and then kind of synthesize it into your own opinion, because I think that definitely made your message a lot more meaningful. And I actually share a lot of your sentiments. So I'm really glad we left it on that. Progress is progress, but at the same time, it is important to highlight the inclusivity part that you mentioned, because that's really important as we move forward. Now, before moving into our conversation with the question and answer period, I did want to ask all of our panelists if there's anything else that you would like to contribute prior to going into the Q&A section, or otherwise we can just go straight there. So feel free to raise your hand if you did want to contribute something, or otherwise we can just go straight into the Q&A portion. Perfect. Okay. So for the Q&A portion of the seminar, everyone should have a Q&A button at the bottom of their screen. So that's how you're able to contribute. Us, the moderators, will be seeing which questions to bring up. But if you want your question to be featured, all you have to do is type it on there. If anyone has any questions, you can just ask in the general chat, and hopefully one of us will help you.
Maybe just since you did ask if anyone has something to add until there are questions, I didn't see any questions. So I would just very quickly like to add this point that yes, young people actually have a really good avenue for participation. It's called Youngo. In case you don't know it yet, because I didn't go alone, I actually went with a group of my students, plus we had 2 who went through Youngo. It's basically a young NGO taken to Youngo. And it's a really good way to become involved, to understand how the process works, and to also get access in a very informed manner. And yeah, I mean, the students sort of gave the feedback, they learned a lot, but they also fear for next year because the UK presidency gave them a huge platform. and the Egyptian representative didn't even have 2 minutes for them before she took off again. And yeah, they couldn't raise any points. So I think more young people need to be involved to make their voices heard.
Thank you. And Professor?
Just commenting, waiting for questions to come in, but I'll just make a different comment. One thing I noticed, since several of us were there, was the absence of Chinese participants, obviously the participants, government delegates and civil society, were heavily weighted to the global north. That would be true just because of economics. It was being held in Scotland. COVID restrictions all contributed to that, but there was still a very tangible number of participants from many parts of the world. I certainly saw, two countries, India, not surprisingly, but also Brazil, all kinds of participants from both of those large developing countries in taking part in many different things. But I began to notice after a couple of days, I was seeing almost no Chinese participants. Now, of course, the Chinese official delegation was there. And they had one small pavilion that was hosted by some Chinese companies, but most of the content was actually being delivered by other organizations whom the Chinese had made access to. They even reached out to us in Simon Fraser University if we wanted to give a seminar in their space. So I only mention that because given how central China is to these solutions and the important technology and the commitments the government of China has made, the centrality of Chinese companies, and the fact that there's really strong technical knowledge in China, its absence was, I noticed it, and I'm not drawing any bigger conclusions. I think maybe the best explanation was travel restrictions were very severe for Chinese citizens this past year, but I certainly hope in the future we'll be able to see more participants from that major country at these events.
Karolina?
I just thought I would share because I'm also going to participate in a delegation to Stockholm Plus 50, and there is a youth policy paper that is being created right now. So I thought I could share the link actually to that. I'm not sure if I can share it with everyone, but I put it in the chats. There really is a lot more focus on getting the youth voice heard at Stockholm Plus 50. So there's definitely a lot of ways to get involved. So I just thought I would share that with the audience.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing that. I was actually really intrigued when you brought it up earlier. So I appreciate you sending the link in the chat if anyone's interested as well. So thankfully, we have received a couple of questions that we can use for our Q&A portion. So one is coming from an anonymous attendee, and they're just wondering which political actor you believe played the most critical role in COP26. Do you guys have any insight on that question? If you found that there were no political actors that were relevant, that is.
I'll just throw out a name, and I wasn't following the negotiations, but clearly the COP president, Alok Sharma, played a critical role. He had a high degree of visibility. My impression, he's highly articulate. I think he really did capture both the sense of at the end and the conclusions. He was not happy with the end result, notwithstanding the huge amount of work. That's not the normal posture. Frankly, if his prime minister had been summing up the conference, it would have had a rather different spin to it. I think he is, from what I can tell at a great distance, he does a very good job of articulating the urgency and the necessity of moving forward and keeping the eye of the presidency. He'll be handing over to his Egyptian counterpart this year, but he would be one personality whom I hope we will continue to see in the climate space, the same way that we saw Laurence Toubiana, for instance, from COP21, continues to be very influential in climate politics.
Thank you for sharing your take on that question. Does anyone else have anyone else in mind, or even want to build on what Professor Small was saying?
Well, I think it's actually going in a similar direction, but that certain sort of senior delegation members that have been around for a really long time and have like networks and connections to many other delegations, they really seem to be like important policy influencers in a way that we don't really get to see outside of the COP. Like, we see the result and it's attributed to countries, but then there are all these public officials that are not really acknowledged. And I think, yeah, I would just sort of highlight their role, the ones that spend 2 weeks hardly sleeping, eating way too little, being sort of, you know, everywhere at the same time, trying to somehow bring together all these opinions, plus the people from the UNFCCC Secretariat staff that support them. I mean, that is just amazing what they do. And I can't name a single person.
That's completely okay as well. Thank you. Professor Eames?
Yeah, thank you very much. I was going to say, when debriefing the COP21, for example, with the chair, Laurent Fabius, or with other ministers that were there, they tended to emphasize a quartet of people. That's for the COP21 in Paris. So there was UNFCCC, Christiana Figueres, an amazing person. There was the French presidency, and it was both Laurent Fabius doing a strategic planning over 3 years of all the relationships. You know, they literally like had a battle plan of every country that had to have bilateral and etc., and including give and takes in it. And then Laurence Tubiana, working very closely with Christiana Figueres. And then often we hear mentioned John Kerry and Todd Stern for the US side, and Xie Zhenghua for the Chinese. And so when there were blockades at the end with Nicaragua or whatever, it would be those four that would be the firefighters. And Laurent Fabius would call Xie Zhenghua and say, go fix that, because he won't talk to me. And eventually they called the Pope to help. In any case, there was this group of four, and that was of five, right? That would be the essential. Did we have a dynamic like this at COP26 from your observation? And apart from the UK, with delegation to Alok Sharma, what was the role of the US, the role of Xie Zhenghua? The same Xie Zhenghua was there. And then, of course, UNCCC, it's not Christiana Figueres anymore, but I wonder how you observe that.
Yeah, I regret I can't really offer too much insight into that. I think in part not quite as high profile, because there was less to negotiate for the reasons that Jennifer Allan explained. I mean, the big deal had been crunched in Paris. John Kerry was absolutely there with his Chinese counterpart, and they weren't as visible. He wasn't the Secretary of State, and it's a few years on, but nevertheless, who were those close insiders? I couldn't identify. But I suspect that none of them played the role, quite the same visibility as the figures that you named for COP21. There was more emphasis on, there's always celebrities that come to these things. I don't think they made a huge impact, but I think what's really important is maintaining the media attention. And in her own particular way, and Karolina, I'd be very interested in your point of view as to how you would assess the role of Greta Thunberg in terms of impact, because she has become a celebrity easily on a scale with any of the other names that have been mentioned.
I could answer that question now, maybe. I think, Greta has been wonderful to get the attention of people. And I think there has been a real paradigm shift, especially among the young people. And I think people are way more aware, and also they feel that they have a voice, that they can actually put pressure on policymakers. And I think that is very important. The one thing I am worried about is just as I mentioned earlier, is this nihilism and the negativity, because it's very easy. And even I know that I sometimes get into this mindset of hopelessness. And I think that is the biggest danger that we're facing when it comes to this crisis. And especially when it comes to the global north, because we have to continue putting pressure on our governments to come up with the money necessary. So that I really think that there's kind of two sides of this story. She had an extremely positive impact on gaining attention to the movement, but now I think, especially when we're moving away from towards implementation, I think we need to be careful. And I also think it's very important not to give the voice only to Greta. And I think media has sometimes done this too much. It's only Greta who gets all the attention, whereas at COP, I mean, I met wonderful young representatives of indigenous communities, of local communities, and from anywhere ranging from the Amazon to the Philippines. And I really wish they were given a platform and that we listen to them, because often they have more tangible problems that we can actually help solve. And I feel that Greta is more of this broad overarching figure, but I really think we need to focus on more specific tangible problems. And I think that is not really happening when all the attention is given to her.
Thank you, Karolina. Maybe I'll just pass it on to Florentine to see if she had anything to say about the Greta.
I actually fully agree with Karolina. So I would like to take that question about the one political actor that matters. And well, we've established that no, it's not one person. And in the same vein, it's not one climate agreement that will save the world. It's so much bigger than that. And, you know, we can't just hope for one agreement to do all the work. It's really about every person, about every NGO, every city, every region, every country. There's so much more that needs to happen than agreement at the international level. It's important, but implementation happens on the ground. And now that the Paris Agreement is entering its implementation phase, and that's great, but it also in a way means that the importance is shifting also to initiatives on a slightly lower level. Of course, an NGO can never regulate a big multinational company, but so much can be done at other levels than the international. And I think we should not forget that. And the more is implemented on different levels, the easier it becomes also to agree on something at the international level, because the pressure isn't so big. So that's my take on the, is there one actor, is there one agreement question.
So there's no magic pill, is what we're hearing, I think, from all of the panelists. Thank you. We do have a couple more questions in the queue, but Karolina, did you want to just maybe do like a quick wrap up of the question?
Yes, very quickly. It just came to my mind that, you know, even though there aren't a particular actor, I think the emphasis on science, and especially with the IPCC report coming out right before COP26, I think that was really useful and important. And especially, I think it reaffirmed keeping 1.5 degrees alive. And I think that is essential. So to some extent, I would say that was also an important kind of actor, the scientific community.
Of course, yeah. No, the scientific community is definitely an important actor on this. So thank you for bringing that up. I would just like to move on to the next question, also posed by an anonymous attendee. So they're wondering, how do you see the recent extreme rise in global tensions affecting future climate negotiations and cooperation, especially between the West and Russia? Or maybe we could phrase it as between the West and the East.
I would like to object to east to the west. That's very broad, and that's like painting a Cold War picture. I don't want to go there. Sorry, but can we be a little bit more nuanced than that, please?
No, for sure. Professor Small, would you like to go ahead?
Well, I'll go after Sandeep. So give the floor to him.
So I think it's a very interesting question, like how would the current conflict impact, future negotiations? Well, in terms of negotiations, like things might change 6 months, 8 months, 10 months down the line. And so, in diplomacy, things change quite quickly, and that can happen. But one long-standing impact of this conflict could be more lock-in of fossil fuels. So what is happening right now is that EU is struggling because of its dependence on Russian gas, and even now talking about ramping up coal and locking in more LNG infrastructure, liquefied natural gas infrastructure. And when you create such lock-in sort of like investments, it's hard to wean off those in the short term. The other thing what's happening is because the global prices for things like oil, gas, coal are so high. So take again the example of India. So coal prices are in the historic high, and India is like almost equal in terms of importing coal. Like it's the second, sometimes first, sometimes second largest coal importer in the world. Now, what's happening because of these high prices? There's a massive impetus inside the country to invest more in coal assets domestically. It's easy when you're import dependent to sort of like say, okay, we'll shut down these coal operations, but if you've taken loans, you are running the show, it's really hard to shut down those operations in the short term because you have so many political considerations. Especially true for India and China, because most of these fossil fuel assets are operated by state-owned companies, funded by state-owned banks. So it leads to a larger question of how much impact this will have long-term in terms of meeting our global climate targets. Because forget phase down, I think the issue would here be like, how do you even like peak if you are already investing so much? So that's what I see as like at least short to medium term impact of the current crisis, which goes beyond West and Russia, but touches Asia, which is the center of energy in the future.
Yeah, I look, Sandeep, I would completely agree with that, and that's an extremely helpful contribution. I'd say in response to the question, Russia itself was never a major player in the climate negotiations in the first place, and few people were looking to them for leadership. Any given country in a UN process can play a spoiler role, but at this point, there isn't a lot left to negotiate. So really, the COPs are about implementation. The United States managed to be, take completely under the Trump administration, walk away from the Paris Agreement, and the world carried on. No, it wasn't that it had no consequence. It did. They were very clever when they designed the Paris Accord that it takes 3.5 years to actually exit the agreement. That was agreed to by the United States government of the day, knowing very well that that would limit the ability for a future American administration to walk away in 6 months' time. So, the structure of the agreements can survive. A major country, Brazil under Bolsonaro, is heading in exactly the wrong direction. There is enough momentum there. What worries me more is not at the level of actual formal geopolitics. It's attention span. Look how critical financing is. You've all spoken to that. Well, the humanitarian needs are going to be enormous, driven by this. And you can expect certainly Western countries, starting with European countries, are going to be huge pressure to increase defense spending. That's going to be in competition with resources for the kind of goals that we've all been talking about. So that's, and I think, to be honest, even if you would expect leaders' mental time share to climate, which for most people is pretty segmented, I would honestly say the UN Secretary General is probably the leader who spends the most amount of time consistently, month in, month out, talking about it. But it's going to be that much more important, frankly, for civil society, for thought leaders like everybody on this call, for businesses in particular, to kind of keep their eye on a medium longer term, because international attention in 2022 will be 100% focused on dealing with this crisis and trying to build an aftermath. And I think we just have to be realistic about that. Thank God Glasgow happened 3 months ago and it wasn't coming up this year, is what I would say.
Of course, yeah. I believe Sandeep also has his hand up. I don't know if you wanted to close off on that question, Sandeep, or if you're okay moving on to the next one.
Move on, that's okay.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So we are running short on time, but I thought that maybe we could just close off on one question that maybe rounds off everything that you have all contributed. It's coming from Jake, and he's just kind of wondering what the best ways are to communicate these ideas to our peers who are less informed or interested without being overwhelming and scaring them away from the subject. So obviously a great conversation to wrap up everything that we've talked about and help us be able to share it with other people that we want to share it with without overwhelming them. Does anyone have a take on the question?
maybe try to find one particular aspect that they're most interested in, because climate negotiations are just so overwhelming that if you give them one access point, right? If someone is interested in climate justice, or someone's interested in finance, or in a specific country, try to communicate it through that. So yeah, you can, you know, introduce them to the issue and then take it from there. But also, actually, yeah, I think talks like this might be an interesting format. There are lots of them online, and if you have a few good ones that you can recommend, people are used to Netflix, so why not have some, you know, climate change videos that you can watch?
I guess to jump in before anyone else says anything else, we do also have the third part of the series is going to be on youth activism when it comes to climate politics. So if you are kind of like a student, obviously it may be intimidating. So hopefully attending that talk will also give you an idea of how to share these thoughts and how to speak to people about the things that we're witnessing in conferences like COP26. But did anyone else have any insight on the last question? Karolina.
Yeah, I just think, but you mentioned it, I think it's important to really show that there are solutions out there and there are ways we can think about it. And I think also focusing on what the people that you're talking to, what kind of background they have. You know, if you're in engineering or business, you know, there are a lot of solutions that come from those disciplines. So I think I would really say focus on the positive and also the action base. I think that's, at least from my experience, I think people shy away from the subject because it just feels hopeless, as we have said before. I think that is my pro tip.
My little piece of advice, inspired frankly by this conversation, is identify somebody who inspires you and talk to your friends or other people about that. And it could be a well-known figure. It could be Greta Thunberg. It could be a scientific figure. It could be somebody in your community. It could be an activist who you've read about or seen online from another country who's doing concrete, practical things, the sort of people that Karolina was just talking about. Try to humanize this. I mean, people who work in this space, including myself, will talk in numbers and charts and graphs, and that's fine in an academic university audience, but that doesn't communicate emotionally to people. It doesn't motivate people. But if you can put people's faces and diverse people's faces behind it and give a sense of solidarity, and there are solutions that different people are working on, each often with very different capacities, I find that helps individuals find a way into some constructive work in this space.
Would you like to go ahead, Yves?
Yes, it's very, very quick. I just noticed Greg Yan has put one question twice, and maybe very simply, it's a nuts and bolts question. To be on the 2 degrees trajectory, we're supposed to, at least the 1.5 trajectory, we're supposed to reduce 50% by 2030 from what roughly where we are. 8 years. That's why everyone calls this a crucial decade. So how likely are we going to get there? That was the question. I don't know if we can ask quick take from either Florentine or Michael or Sandeep or Karolina. A quick response.
I can ramble a little bit about this. So I think yeah, it is not an easy task. It's a complex task that spans, like for a country, spans from finance to political economy to the question of technology and so on. So it's really, really complex. One of the ways, and I have learned this the hard way, that while the focus should definitely be on these international negotiations, and which are useful, and absolutely that sets the global framework and the direction, I think all the hard work has to be done in states or provinces. So I think if we have to achieve these net zero, I mean, there's all these targets, but who is going to implement? It's the states and the provinces. So going forward, I feel like if we have any hope, we have to engage more extensively in the states, in the provinces, in every country, even in countries that are not democratic. I think the states have a critical power, and in most countries, it's the states have control over the energy resources by, control in the sense that like they have a say, that it's not only the federal jurisdiction. So I think we have to work both top down, which is the negotiations and, the big agreements, but you also have to work with the states, empower the states, like work with the states. I think that is, to me, that would be the way. And within that framework, work with every stakeholder in the state. I think that's the only way I see to mobilize what we have to do in a very short amount of time.
If I may, I would like to quickly add on to that. I absolutely agree with you, Sandeep. I think that's a very good point to make, that, everyone needs to be involved. However, this involvement also requires the space to do so. And this does go back to a little bit of global politics and the sort of, number of democracies that has recently declined again. And the Paris Agreement and the way it stresses non-state actors and that so much needs to happen at the domestic level requires that space for action. So I'm actually hoping for something like the EU border adjustment tax and something like this to happen in the US as a way to pressure other countries that don't allow civil society space and less democratic involvement. I think we need different approaches. We definitely need every level involved, but we also need some sort of pressure mechanism that goes beyond saying pretty please and actually has some sort of, well, sanctions is such a bad word, but some sort of enforcement mechanism that builds up pressure. And I think a carbon border adjustment tax might well be that, or any ideas. But yeah, I think with more instruments like that, we can still do it.
Thank you for jumping in. I think that really added to what Sandeep was saying. There's one last question. I know we're running 4 minutes over time, so maybe we can make it really short. And Dilma is just wondering, what are the roles of individuals to reduce climate crisis, or what are the roles that individuals can take to kind of reduce the climate crisis? Florentine?
Well, there's so many. I mean, first of all, you can reduce your own consumption of fossil fuels, right? You can start with that. You can change the way you get from A to B, but you can also be politically active, as in talk to your friends, your family about who they vote for, right? We need climate to be a voting issue, so you can actually raise that topic. You can become an activist. So you can change your own lifestyle, you can campaign, you can be more politically active. You could join Yango or any other institution that goes to COP as an observer to learn more and inspire more people. There are many ways to do something.
Just to reinforce, just briefly to reinforce that, a climate communicator and scientist I like very much, you may well know of her, Katharine Hayhoe, has a very widely watched TED Talk saying the most important thing you can do to fight climate change, talk about it. I never cease to be amazed outside meetings like this of people who are my age and my contemporaries. They all know that this is what I spend my time doing. I can count on the fingers of one hand the numbers who actively ask me, what happened in Glasgow, or have any ongoing interest in the subject. And if any of them are listening, I'm not talking about you, that's all the other friends of mine. It really is striking. Most people, it's a big, scary topic for everybody. And most people don't want to talk or think about it. So if you're spending some time on this panel and session and you're asking that question, good for you. And find ways of bringing up the questions or concerns you have in what you would regard as a normal conversation, whether it's your friends or family or at work. Work is a good place to do this. Get people thinking about all the different ways, because there's so many practical things that we can do, as well as absolutely being advocates and citizens in the way that Florentine just said.
Karolina, would you like to contribute something quickly?
Yeah, just to continue on that thought, I really think also as a student, you can make sure to take courses, educate yourself on this. UBC is a wonderful place to do so. And when you choose what you want to do with your life, choose work environments where the environment and climate is the main focus. I think that is something that especially young people can do for sure. So that's just what I wanted to add.
As well as follow the link to the Google Doc she prepared if you are looking to do it yourself. But since that was the end of the Q&A section and we are a little bit over time, I did just want to wrap this up by providing a few thank you statements. So obviously, thank you to our audience for your time and attention today. Thank you to the 4 wonderful experts for their statements and answers. Obviously, thank you to Jennifer Allan for starting us off with that amazing video. Thank you to the Konakai Chair, the Center for Japanese Research at UBC, Professor Tibergen and his wonderful team, as well as my colleagues at the International Relations Students Association here at UBC for putting this together. I hope that everyone found this discussion insightful. I know for a fact I did, and we'll log off this meeting with a better idea of the current state of climate politics today, all the things that we're doing well, and all the things that we must improve on. So I'm hoping that you'll have a great rest of your day or night, wherever you're joining us from. I know for a fact I will be going to sleep now, but I hope that you do log off with being glad that you came, and I really appreciated everyone being here today. So feel free to log off whenever you're able to.
And I'll add my special thanks to everyone, and especially for those of you in Europe. I know it's already 11 p.m., so special thanks. And yeah, this was wonderful, extremely high quality discussion. We're very blessed. Thank you.